So the question is, why bother use socketio? Well, let's say you're at work and you get a ticket. Naturally, the ticket doesn't say use socketio or WebSockets. It just says, I want some real-time communication between our website and the data. And you, being the savvy, hip developer that you are, decide you are not going to use socketio for reasons we mentioned in the last video. You want to get as close to the metal as possible, so instead you're going to use WebSockets. And you get started and you start to pound it out, and it's awesome. It comes together really well, and you just know that the marketing people, the development team, the CIO, whoever you're going to demo this for is going to be really impressed by it. Except when it goes to QA, the QA person notices that it's not working for some reason in certain situations, and you cannot figure out why. Well, after some research, you find out that when the machine or the connecting browser that's using your WebSockets is behind a misconfigured proxy, you can't get through. And that's not going to happen all that often, but you do need to deal with it because it's serious when it does. So you do some work, and it's a little bit irritating, but you knock it out, and you get it so that WebSockets can get through that stuff. Well, let's say the next thing that happens is the server goes down. Not for very long, but it does go down. And at that point, the connection gets wiped out. The server comes back up, and there is no reestablished connection, which means the browser now is just sitting on stale data. It isn't real time anymore, and the user doesn't know that. Okay? So now you have to build in some kind of mechanism where if this disconnects, we're going to have a reconnection built into this thing so that if you get disconnected, you'll reconnect. And then you also realize that, say this is a chat room, because a chat room's easy to explain. Let's say this client needs to be able to connect to /admin and needs to be in a room called /general and needs to be in some kind of private room too. Well, you now need to make 3 of these connections in order to satisfy all 3 of these paths or these groups of sockets, because you'll want that user to get all the messages sent to admin, all the messages sent to general, and all the messages that come in via private message. So now you have to create 3 connections, or as many connections as every client is going to use. All right, so you started off with just WebSockets, and then I'm going to put in orange here. You had to develop the reconnection stuff, and you had to develop a means of getting to the machine if it's behind something that would otherwise prevent you from seeing its IP address, and you have to implement the ability to have a client connected to multiple sockets. And then you get to a point where you need some kind of acknowledgement. So let's say you send something over from the server, and the browser needs to send back, hey, I got this. And then the server can run a callback or something. So I'm going to put over here ACK, which stands for acknowledgements we need to implement. And then one last thing, we'll say in addition to the bad proxy, there are some browsers that are just old. It's just not going to work. WebSockets will not function. So if you want that 3 to 5% of browsers to be able to use your product, you have to implement long polling. So if we take a high-level look, you started with WebSockets because you wanted to be close to the metal. But you had a bad proxy type situation, and so you had to implement long polling. Okay, and then you were getting disconnects, so you had to implement reconnection. And maybe you mess with how it buffers, maybe you mess with how the packets line up before reconnection, I don't know, whatever. We won't talk about that at the moment. But then you had to implement multi-room support because users needed to be able to get messages from different types of rooms, so like /admin, /general, /PM or whatever. Okay, and your overhead was too high. We didn't talk about this in our drawing, but you had to add some kind of multiplexing support because you had way too many connections open to be able to keep them straight. The overhead was high, etc. And then lastly, you needed acknowledgements to be able to talk back and forth between the server. Okay, so what you just made here in your WebSocket Plus thing, in order to get your app to handle all the use cases that you need, is better known to the world as, you guessed it, socketio. Meaning, what you could do over here by yourself, this already does out of the box. The difference is this thing over here on the right has a score of developers all over the world who are probably way better at this than you are, instead of you having to do it over here all by your lonesome. That is why you'd use socketio, because socketio is not one for one against WebSockets. It's not you choose one or the other. It's that WebSockets is a base layer for it. I'll draw it out here. Socketio is built on Engine.io, and we'll talk about this here in a second when we look at the documentation. Underneath Engine.io is WebSockets, as well as some other options. So Engine.io isn't just using WebSockets, it's using a whole bunch of stuff. So it's not like you have a choice between using WebSockets or Socketio. Socketio will actually use WebSockets whenever it possibly can. But if you want the benefit of long polling, reconnection, multi-room, and multiplexing, as well as acknowledgments, then it only makes sense, in my opinion, to use Socketio. And you're gonna want those in most production level apps. An almost perfect illustration that I can think of is electric cars. I love electric cars. They're great for so many reasons, but I don't own one. I own a plug-in hybrid. So in the morning when I get up, assuming I remember to plug my car in, I'll get 30 to 50 miles, depending on how I drive. I'd like to build a greenhouse with solar panels on top and charge it that way, but that doesn't matter. The reason I don't have an all-electric car is because, at least in the United States, the infrastructure is not there so that if I need to make a 250-plus mile journey, it's either really inconvenient or maybe even impossible. Every tiny town in the US has a gas station, so I can always fall back on my gas engine if I need to, but I've got that 30 to 50 miles of electricity for most of my other trips. But again, in those rare occasions when I drive a long ways, I have something to fall back on. But 95% of the time, I'm using electricity. I hope the US, or if you're not from the US, wherever your country is, gets to a point where you've got chargers everywhere and there's no inconvenience at all driving an electric car, however far you may need to. But it's not there yet. Okay, Socketio. Most of the time, you're going to get the power of WebSockets. Most of the time. We'll say 95%. I mean, I made that number up, like my hybrid. But there's once in a while you're going to need to make those long journeys where you need to fall back on that gas engine, right? Socketio, you're not going to be able to use WebSockets. You're going to need that long polling, or you're going to need reconnection and disconnection checks. You're going to need those multi-room multiplexing things. You fall back on them when you need them, and you don't have to implement them. That is why you should use Socketio.